Hello, Soul Stirred listeners. Welcome back. Today, we are here with Terry Clark. Terry is a high energy professional with extensive experience in federal law enforcement and intelligence for over 30 years. He understands exactly where you are coming from and the challenges for executives and teams to operate at peak performance. Terry is both a certified teacher of mindfulness-based stress reduction, and he is an certified epigenetics human potential and performance coach, able to get you and your team into an optimized zone of functioning and flow. There is so much to Terry. I was reading his information before we got on and looking at his website, and I suspect there's so much more to the story. So, Casey, I want to turn it over to you so that you can kick us off and give us a little bit more, some deeper information about who Terry is.
Absolutely. Thank you for that brilliant introduction. I notice myself feeling my heart full of pride right now because, in addition to all of the things that you just said about Terry Clark, he's also my brother. And I happen to know that there's a lot of background and context and biography to understand that led to all of those high achieving things that you just listed in his bio. So I'm so excited, Terry, to have you here with us today and to share you with our Soul Stirred audience. And I just want to invite you to tell us a little bit more. Give us some of the twists and turns that have made you the you that we just heard about here today.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Support you in your exploration of deeper meaning in life, right?
Yeah.
So it's we can start at the beginning and the end. We'll use time phase, right? So why don't we start with where I am now, and I'll kind of like tell you how I got here.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay, so right now I'm working on a book on the flow state, and the flow state is when you're in that peak performance operating condition where you lose track of time and space because your capabilities are meeting the challenge at your optimal level.
Yeah.
And it's connected to a higher purpose, like something that you have a lot of passion for, and you're doing it free of distraction. And so I'm writing a book on how to get into the flow state and why you should care about the flow state. One of the benefits of being in the flow state is that you can operate up to 500% of your normal level. So you can 5x your performance. And by doing that, that means that you have more time to do other things that are important to you besides your work, right?
Yeah.
And the work that you do it at a higher level, you perform at a higher level and you get more done and you have more joy in your life. So I thought that was worthy of my time to kind of do a deep dive on that. When I was looking at the wellness space, I looked at all the different aspects of wellness and I thought, well, what's the thing that could put a finer point on it? Because there's so many aspects that come into being well and living your best life. And so all of the levers that you can pull in terms of your lifestyle choices, in terms of sleep, exercise, nutrition, relationship, supplementation, prescriptions, mindfulness, all those aspects, ways that you decide how to do those all contribute to the way that you can optimize your manifestation of your DNA. And your DNA is just the code that you're born with, but you're not locked into what it's going to manifest as in terms of your phenome. You have your genome, which is the letters C's, G's, A's, and T's. Your phenome is how you experience your DNA. And that experience is dictated by all those other choices you make about how you treat your body, how you treat yourself, and how you interact with others on the planet, right?
Yeah.
So I've spent years studying this and reading about it. And so the book is helping me kind of like a crucible, kind of melt away the stuff that's superfluous and get the stuff that's the most important, and then provide that information back to folks. And this is what I enjoy doing now. And I came here after I left federal law enforcement in 2013 after 24 years as a Fed and 27 years in law enforcement. And it's curious, folks say, well, how did you get to wellness? And I explained that when you're in law enforcement, you actually have to be performing at a peak level because you have to be able to run, fight, and shoot on any given day because your life might depend on it, or your partner's life, or the life of some civilian, right? Some citizen that you actually took an oath to protect and defend.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to do that work, the level that I held myself to with integrity, that meant I always had to be able to to operate at a very high level for a long period of time, and if necessary, fight in something against somebody who's trying to take my life or the life of another. And so if you take that seriously, then you have to be fit, you have to be rested, right? You have to be able to emotionally regulate, control your own emotions so you can operate in that thought space at a high cognitive function, even when you have these high threats. And so when I talk about that in my wellness context, I try to explain to people that whatever their threats are, they're probably not going to be the same as they were for me as a federal agent or somebody in the military who has threats to their life. Our challenge in today's world is our brain acts like the threats that we have are threats to our life when they generally aren't. Mm-hmm. And so that takes us out of our polyvagal balance. So when you have that threat to your life, or that perceived threat to your life, your brain acts like it's the same thing. And you go into fight, flight, or freeze. So everybody knows about fight or flight, but your first reaction is something is threatening your life is for you to lock up and hold your breath. If you ever notice when you're really anxious that you're actually holding your breath, you're not breathing. And so what we want to make sure we're doing is that when we're going through life, we realize that these things that we're perceiving as a threat, they aren't actually threatening our lives. They're just something that makes us feel anxious. So if we can notice what we're feeling and we can acknowledge whatever the emotion is, notice where we feel it in our body somatically, right? You get into your somatic self. If you can, in your mind's eye, name the emotion, if you can experience that emotion, then you can continue to be present. And as that emotion dissipates, then you can continue to maintain access to your prefrontal lobe, which is where you do all your higher reasoning. And you can make your best decision based on what's available to you now, rather than what decision was made when you were a child, when you developed these processes to protect yourself when you didn't feel safe. So it's all about your awareness, and that comes from being mindful. And that's why I decided to get trained as a mindfulness teacher. And the aspects that I talked about before in terms of those levers you can pull in terms of your phenomic experience versus your genomic experience, that's the basis of epigenetic wellness coaching, which is where you help people identify what their profile is and identify what their challenges are, and then help them identify what the interventions are to get the best experience of their own life. So in your polyvagal nerve, that's the balance between your parasympathetic and your sympathetic. The sympathetic part of the polarity is the aspect where you are in fight, flight, or freeze. And Emily and I were talking about specifically that most of us, when we feel that kind of stress or that anxiety, we actually go to the freeze state first. We don't even think about fleeing or fighting. We're just stuck. And that's why people hold their breath when they get scared or they get anxious. So if you can notice that yourself, if your breath is not in its normal pattern, if you feel like your chest is tight, and your face is tight or your jaw is clenched, those are somatic aspects of your life experience in your body that are telling you that you're stressed. So if you can notice those, it's always helpful to go back to your breath and just notice that you'll hear somebody that's not practicing this. They'll say something like, "Well, take a deep breath." Well, if somebody's holding their breath, they can't take a deep breath because they're already full.
Right.
So what I learned how to do is say to somebody, like, just blow it out. Because if you're holding your breath, you can still blow it out. And if you blow it out, you're going to take another breath back in because your body's going to make you breathe. So if you notice that you or somebody around you is stressed, just say, blow it out. And as they blow it out, just be with them, and they can get back access to their higher cognitive function. They can get out of their amygdala, right? Your amygdala is where you feel anger and fear, those big reptilian emotions about just being alive, right? But then when you want to solve complex problems or come to a complicated solution that has that awareness, you want to be in your prefrontal lobe, which is the top of your brain and front of your brain, right? So to get access to those, you want to be able to just breathe and be present, be aware of your body sensations, and emotionally regulate. So the way that I came down that path of wanting to go into this space, though, was that as I was in law enforcement, I had to deal with those high stress situations where life and death were actual factors in what we were doing in the moment. But if you're in your amygdala and you're locked up, then you can't make those big decisions. or you can get emotionally triggered. And that's when you see sometimes officers that aren't aware of what they're doing. They might use too much force, or they might lock up and not use force when it's needed to save somebody. So knowing where you are on the use of force gradient, what the actual threats are, what the environment is, and knowing what the emotions are that are present are all part of making good decisions in high stress situations. So I've learned how to do that in my years in law enforcement. And then I try to learn and how to bring that out even better now as I've gotten trained in mindfulness and understanding more about all the aspects that come to being able to emotionally regulate, and actually knowing how the things that happened when you were a child, when you felt unsafe, how those protective mechanisms that the little you might have put in place may or may not serve you anymore. So if you can identify what those events were in your life that created those, as you two who are experts in child protective services, and all the time that you went into those houses where you saw these things happen, you know what an ACE is, an adverse childhood event, right? So when those adverse childhood events happened to us when we were young, we decided when things were too scary for us. And so we would come up with ways to make ourselves feel safe that would console us. Well, what happens as you become an adult is if you haven't identified what those events were, if you haven't processed them, then that little version of you can make those decisions for you as an adult. And that decision isn't usually your best use of self. That's usually what the little you decided was safe. So that's why it's helpful for us to go to therapy, right? It's helpful. That's why it's helpful for us to get coached. That's why it's helpful for us to be mindful, to learn how to sit and meditate, identify what those patterns of thought are, to have a journal every day, to be grateful, to be aware of how we're impacting those around us. And that's how we all get the best life we can have and have the biggest impact we want to have.
Wow. I love what you just described. There are so many things about our nervous system that people are not aware of. And the way that I like how you described when you need to take a breath, exhale, blow it all out. Because when you're like, if someone is having a panic attack and you're like, okay, take a breath, they're like already having shallow breath and can't pull it in. And then they just feel worse. So being able to blow it out, then you want to breathe in. That was awesome. And I'm really fascinated by your experience in law enforcement and the idea of you're trained to run toward the thing that everyone else is running away from. And so you're tricking your brain because as a child, if there's something scary, you learn how to deal with it. You learn to either blend in with the wall or people please or be a high achiever who's going to get out, or there are lots of different mechanisms. But then as an adult, if you're in a profession where you need to not avoid the conflict but move toward it, you are doing something that is counterintuitive. So I'm really excited to hear more about how you learned to do that and where that took you from there.
Yeah. So it's always interesting to me when I talk to people that they hear about the kind of work I did. So I was, my work in federal law enforcement was at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, later named the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. So the history of ATF, just to be very encapsulating it, because I don't want to take up all the time talking about law enforcement history, was that the first taxes that were collected by the United States government were the whiskey taxes. And they actually had to put down a rebellion called the Whiskey Rebellion when the folks didn't want to pay those taxes. And so the first agents of the federal government were the people that went there to make sure they could collect those whiskey taxes, because without money, the government doesn't operate, right? So that was like in 1789. Those are some of the first exercises of the use of the power of the federal government. Flashing forward, they had the Prohibition Agency that you've heard about, Elliot Ness and his fight against Al Capone and the mobs in Chicago. They had rum runners, right? And they had gin mills, right? And so that was all moonshine. All that alcohol had to be taxed. And if somebody wasn't paying the tax, then it was the alcohol tax unit that collected the taxes until Prohibition. Then Prohibition made it illegal. Then they had to stop anybody from using alcohol at all. And then they had to go back when they passed another constitutional amendment to make alcohol legal again to collect those taxes. So that was the Alcohol Tobacco Tax Unit of the IRS after it had been in the Department of Justice's prohibition. All that history comes forward, which is that they created the first gun control acts under the prohibition times. It was called the National Firearms Act because back then you could buy a machine gun on the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And they called those guns gangster-style weapons, which was the machine gun, sawed-off shotgun, sawed-off rifle, and then other aspects of the law. I don't want to go too deep into it, but the gangsters were using firearms and explosives to enforce their territory against their competition and then to fight off law enforcement. Anytime you make something prohibited, you create a contraband item, you raise the value of it over what it would otherwise be. And that raised value then means that you're taking in all this cash and you can't put it in the bank. You can't call the police when somebody wants to steal your money or steal your product. You have to enforce it yourself. So that's what brings violence into those markets, just like it does in the drug markets now all over the United States and all over the world.
Wow. That is a really fascinating thing. I've never heard it described that way before.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when Denver passed the marijuana legalization, right, when they were one of the first places to do that, it's still illegal federally, but they said we're not going to enforce it locally. And so what that did, though, is it took a lot of the violence out of the sales of marijuana locally, because there are people killing each other over marijuana all over the United States, which is crazy. People say, well, it's just marijuana. Well, yeah, but if it's illegal, it's got value. And if it's got value, people will kill each other over it, especially when you can't call the police to tell people somebody's stealing your stash or your cash, right?
Yeah. I saw an episode of Cops with
an
that one
intriguing
time.
kind of a historical thing to talk about. But, that's not what I'm here about today. What I'm here about today is to say that when I was an ATF agent, I was enforcing the federal firearms and explosives laws. I was working with the DEA, with FBI, with the Customs Service, and with local law enforcement. And I'd work on, because there are only 2,500 ATF agents in the country. So that comes out to about 50 per state, right? 50 states, 25, right? So there's an average, right? There's 50 per state. And so if you look at that, that means that with that limited resource, we had to use that resource on the most important, the most significant aspects of our jurisdiction. And that was people that were serial shooters. That means people shooting more than one person, or organized crime that is using guns or explosives illegally as part of their conspiracy. So the types of cases that ATF agents work are cartels and street gangs and biker gangs, right? And organized crime, like the traditional organized crime is like La Cosa Nostra, the Italian mafia, right? So that was the oldest ones, but there's still the triads that are still working, the Chinese triads. There's still the cartels between the southwest border and the United States, all over the United States, because there's so much money in drug trafficking. But the thing that is that we don't call them drug cartels anymore. We call them transnational criminal organizations, because they're really in the business of making money. They're not actually in the business of narcotics exclusively anymore. They can do human trafficking. They're into corruption. They're into like cyber crime. They're into like shipping thousands of stolen vehicles all over the world that are stolen in the United States and driven across the southern border.